Back in the 1970s, my mom was a teenager living in Houston during the winter. He and her 9 siblings lived in the Heights, which she says is a nice neighborhood now, but at the time was something of a slum. Her family was super poor. Anyways, my mom had a crush on one of her brother's friends. He was around 14 or 15 at the time. He was a few years older, but she was in love. His name was Mark. Well, around this time, boys started disappearing from the neighborhood. They weren't leaving notes or telling anyone that they were leaving. The families were calling the police, but the police weren't doing anything about it. They decided that the boys had run away, and never really looked into it either. After all, these were poor kids living in a bad neighborhood. They ran away all the time. Life goes on. Then one day Mark disappears too. Meanwhile, my mom's younger brother is hitching a ride out to the beach to go fishing. He did this on a regular basis and would bum a ride from anyone. On the way to the beach, the guy driving the car stops to fill up the gas tank. The guy working at the gas station, Mom says they called him Weird Larry, notices my uncle and asks who he's with. My uncle replies that he doesn't actually know the guy. Larry won't let my uncle go any further and makes him get out of the car. The driver goes on without him. Now then, 3 years have passed since the boys started disappearing, and they finally found out what had happened. A man had been paying 2 boys to lure teenage boys to his house, where he took advantage of them, then strapped them to a wooden board, continued to do so, and then left them for dead. There were at least 28 victims, and Mark Scott was one of them. The only reason they found out was because the 2 teenagers murdered the serial killer, then told the police about all of the murders and led them to some of the bodies. And guess who picked up my uncle that day he was going fishing? This is a true story. I was about 4 or 5 years old and my parents had just separated. It had been snowing heavily during this time, and everyone in the neighborhood was seemingly stuck for the next couple of days. After the snow had finally stopped falling, business had resumed as usual, and once again things went back to normal. But it was too cold to be outside. My mom was living in a 2-bedroom townhouse. I had my own room, but I preferred to sleep in her bed whenever I was staying with her. Our 2 bedrooms were at the end of the hallway, directly across from each other. Our house was a ranch-style home with no upstairs. And I remember that it was in the middle of the winter, and my mom had a window open in her room that was opened ever so slightly, which was directly behind the bed, above the headboard. This was to occasionally get some fresh air and circulation in the room, even through the winter. It didn't happen all the time, but the time that it did, I remember something else creepy happened. I woke up in the middle of the night, and remember sitting up and seeing that our cat was sitting in the doorframe of my mother's room. Her door was open, and you could partially see into my bedroom. This was strange because our cat was typically always in bed with us. As I was watching him, he then walked into my bedroom and meowed. I turned my face to my mom and woke her up. In the 3 or 4 seconds it took her to wake up and ask me what was wrong. We looked back up in the doorframe, and there was an old man standing by my open door, making his way out of my bedroom. I still don't know how she managed to do it so quickly, but my mother proceeded to pick me up and literally throw me out of the screen window. She quickly followed, and we were able to start screaming for help, and someone called 911. The police came and noticed that there were snow prints from the outside leading all the way to the door. Apparently our front door was unlocked, which led them to believe the man must have exited that way. The strange thing was that my mom swore up and down that she had locked the door that night with the deadbolt and chain lock. About a week later, she was cleaning the kitchen and opened up our water heater closet and found a notebook with names and drawings, as well as a pair of gloves and some gum wrappers. The police were called again, but all they could do was speculate that the man had been in our home and hid until we were asleep. The creepiest moment during this period of time was when my mom was asleep in her room. Then she woke up to hearing the faint sounds of breathing and grunting in her own bedroom, but couldn't locate just where the sound was coming from. However, it sounded like it was coming from her closet. Alarmed, She quietly went to reach for the phone to call the police. When the police arrived, they marched up to the bedroom and made a startling discovery. There, hiding in the closet, was an elderly man with nothing but his underwear. The man apparently had broken into the home to seek shelter from the frigid temps. Oh, he had somehow managed to hide inside the home for weeks on end without detection, and sometimes he'd entered through the window if it were open. The man was transported to the hospital and went on to make a full recovery, but the situation definitely creeped us out, and we ended up moving away soon after. My mom started dating a guy she met on a dating site. That part is fine. I had recently started dating the woman who later became my wife, and we met online subsequently. I'll just refer to her as my wife for the story. Anyway, my wife and I never really liked this guy. We didn't think he was mean or anything like that, just a little creepy. The man was quiet. He kept his eyes closed a lot, and occasionally said odd things like offering my wife a chocolate, and then popping one in his mouth, closing his eyes, and moaning as he let it melt in his mouth. One time my wife and I were visiting my mom, but she got called into work, so we waited at her house. Her boyfriend was over, but he spent the entire several hours just hanging out in her bedroom with the door closed. Just before Christmas, my mom and the guy started having some difficulties. My wife and I were visiting her for the holidays, and she dropped all of her problems on us, and we listened carefully and told her our opinions and suggested that she would be better off without him. She already had her mind made up though, and decided to break up with him on Christmas Eve. We spent the night at my mom's and got up early on Christmas morning to visit my dad at his house. We didn't plan to spend the night at my dad's, but we got snowed in, which was actually a nice Christmas surprise. The next day we left as soon as we could get through the snow, and my wife suggested that we stop by my mom's house on the way, so that we could see if she was okay. My wife just had a really bad feeling about my mom's now ex-boyfriend. My mom's car was in the driveway, but that doesn't mean much because she lives close enough to work that she often walks, and it hadn't snowed in her town. She also never locks her door, which drives me crazy. So we let ourselves in. That's when we see blood oozing out of the refrigerator's water's dispenser. It had filled up the spilled container and was leaking out onto the floor and had made a puddle. My wife screamed and I freaked out. I fully expected to see my mom's head in the freezer. I nervously opened the freezer to find a horse's head stuck in the freezer. It was the most foul thing I've ever witnessed in my entire life, and I immediately bolted out of there. I guess you could say that confirms that the boyfriend was kinda creepy. The scariest experience I ever had in a forest was when I was about 12 years old. My parents owned about 6 acres of forest and 6 acres of garden, cleared area. One afternoon we had already picked all the garden veggies that we had to, and I was allowed to do what I wanted. Since we were all through with the work for the day, I proceeded to take a walk down into the forest. There was a clearing of some sort that my dad had made to drive down into the forest, but it could only be accessed by a 4-wheel drive, since there were lots of little stumps and bushes. This forest was pretty much untouched woods. We had previously had to bury my little pet chihuahua due to her getting very sick and passing away some weeks before this particular day, and I wanted to visit her grave. We had her buried way back at the very back of the property and made her a little grave that we could visit if we wanted to, and this was a pretty day, so I decided to go visit my little canine's friend's grave alone. I went all by myself. I stayed a few minutes and said a few words and left. As I was starting my way back through the 6 acres of woods, not having any fear at all, I started feeling like I was being watched. A very strong sense that I was being observed by someone or something. I stopped and looked around, but I didn't see anything that looked out of the ordinary. Actually, everything was eerily quiet. Something in my extrasensory part of my brain told me to run, and run as fast as I could, or I may not make it out of these woods. I started to run, but I tried to just run normally and not make it look like I was panicking. but inside I was panicking. I kept turning and looking over my shoulder and didn't stop. I felt like I was being pursued, but at that point I just booked it out of there. Thankfully, I made it to the clearing, and safely of where my parents were. I knew I was then safe at that point. I started to think that maybe it had all been in my head, and I overreacted. I mean, I had been in those woods countless times exploring without any fear ever. Later on that evening, we heard on the news that a dangerous escaped convict was on the loose. And you guess where? He was in the woods where I was. That was where the authorities had pinpointed it. At the time, I was in the very section of the woods where he was. I'm glad that I listened to my inner voice to run and not stop. Who knows if he would have hurt me, but I'm very glad to know that God planted that in my brain. I believe that he talks to us. It may not be an audible voice that we can hear, but he does put thoughts in our minds. Years ago, I was walking back to camp after deer hunting one evening. I was walking on a long, narrow old dirt road and the trees had formed a canopy over the road. That scene got my heart beating just from being creepy looking. But that was nothing compared to 5 minutes after that. As I walked down this road, I thought I heard footsteps in the leaves about 30 to 40 feet into the woods. The sun had recently gone down, but the tree canopy made it even darker so I could not see very far. The steps seemed like they were keeping stride with me, so I brushed it off as an echo to start with. After a minute or so, I knew it was not an echo. I started trying to catch it, taking an extra step by walking a few steps and then stopping suddenly. Every time I stopped, the footsteps stopped. By this time, I am really getting nervous and short-tempered. I stepped up my pace and was walking along at a steady rate. In the middle of a stride, I stopped my foot about an inch before it touched the ground. Crunch. Whatever was walking beside me finished its step and crunched the leaves. I was so scared I was almost numb and started feeling sick. It was dead silent for about 5 seconds with neither of us moving. Then, all of a sudden, the footsteps started coming towards me. I knew it was not a small animal, because besides the leaf crunching, there was a definite light thud with every step, like when you run in hiking boots. I shouted at whatever it was to identify itself, or I would shoot. As I was shouting, I was reaching for a gun. Where did I put my rifle? Please God. Pistol. I guess I was too terrified to think straight. Where the fridge is my pistol? I finally found it in its holster on my belt. Mind you, all of these thoughts are happening in milliseconds. Turned out my rifle on my shoulder. That is 9 kinds of scared when you can't find your rifle on your shoulder. I'm here to tell you. Thankfully, I finally found my SIG on my hip. I pulled that 45 so hard I ripped the hammer snap clean off the holster. I emptied 2 magazines of 45 caliber and then remembered my shouldered 306. I pulled the rifle around and started bolting rounds as fast as I could squeeze the trigger. After emptying the 4-round magazine, I pulled a fresh magazine out of my pocket and bolted a new round. About this time I had my wits about me and remember my 500,000 spot light that is in my backpack. Instead of taking the time to untie the wonderful knot I had put in leather tie straps before leaving my blind, found the spotlight and lit up the woods. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I stood there dumbfounded. I could not believe that there was nothing there. When I started firing into the woods, the footsteps were 10 feet from me and still coming in my direction. I walked to the edge of the woods and discovered that I was not crazy. There were human-sized footsteps in the leaves running parallel to the ground I had been walking. Sure enough, they turned and started coming straight towards the road I was standing on, but then they just stopped. I mean, plumb vanished, like somebody had taken flight and just disappeared into the sky. Before that night, I'd never been scared to be in the woods alone. I consider myself to be a man who can hold his own in the worst of situations. I have braved odds before that would make many men buckle, but that night I was scared. I mean, want your mommy scared. Before that night I had cried 2 other times in my life. That night was number 3. I never went back into the woods on that property without a buddy. Say what you will about me taking a buddy with me, but you weren't there. After reading the stories from those links at the beginning of this thread, I can't help but wonder if I met with the same creature that night. I don't remember smelling rotten meat, but the wind was to my back when I was looking into the woods. I remember that, because I dang near strained my neck 2 times from whipping around after being hit in the head with leaves blowing off the trees behind me. What really creeps me out is that I heard the whispers. Until tonight, I thought that weird noise was just the wind whistling through the trees. It was very distinct whispering, but at the same time sounded distant and muffled. I should have not ignored that sound, because I knew deep down inside that that was not the wind. I could not reproduce the sound if I tried. I'm not someone with a vivid imagination, though I guess that's why I did not think twice about the sound until now. At the time, it just made sense to assume it was just the wind, because the wind was blowing lightly, and I was in the woods. Normal stuff usually. I am grateful I did not know what was making that sound at the time, because I would have had to have wet my pants to the animation of tears. Guys, I actually screamed help me, to God, as I was screaming the first round off of my SIG. As I was firing that pistol, I promised God that if he would help me through that night, that I would not miss church anymore on Sundays to go hunting. That lasted 2 weeks. I think he understands. I'll plead the fifth on my personal beliefs, but I will tell you of an incident that I experienced in 1998. I used to bush hog and keep up around an abandoned house for hunting rights on the property. I never met the people that used to live in the old house. I do know the granddaughter of the owners, and she's in her 50s. I would let the property get pretty grown up, then go and lay it down with my tractor. Around the house was 3 to 4 overgrown apple trees and a long row of super knogs. One day as I was making my rounds as close as I could get to the tree hanging limbs, I saw a friendly looking older man in a set of light blue overalls just standing at the old cellar door. Kinda startled me, as I made the sweep around the tree and back into the edge of the woods. An old AN, the bush hog, wound up behind it. Can't stop too fast, so I turned the tractor around to make another pass and talk to the stranger. Went right back to the spot where he was, and he was nowhere to be found. I make a lap around the house and barn, and no car or person was to be found. I thought it was odd, but no real big deal at the time. Several months passed and the deer season was over. I just happened to run into the granddaughter at the gas station. Take note that I knew the lady, but very seldom ever contacted her. It was a given that I was responsible for the bush hogging in return for hunting rights. This had gone on for 8 years. I had no idea whether her grandparents were dead, or alive, or other. I just assumed that they were deceased due to her being in her 50s. At the station was made small talk, and she asked how the home place looked. I told her that it was slowly weathering and showing its age. Told her all the windows were still intact, and the doors were still hinged and locked with a basic padlock. I asked her if anyone she knew of was ever over there. I wasn't wanting anyone to encroach on my well-earned hunting spot. She said that to the best of her knowledge, no one from the family had ever been there in over a year. Of course she asked why, and I told her of the man with the light blue overalls at the cellar door. She turned ghostly white, and I saw the goosebumps literally rise on her arm. I asked her if something was wrong, and she teared up and said my papa had a little wood shop in what I called the cellar. She then went on to say that all his life, he wore light blue overalls all the time, with the only exception being going to bed or the rare church visit. She then told me that they had actually buried him in a set of those overalls since it was part of his lifestyle. Then the goosebumps came over me like a bucket of cold water. I honestly believe the old man had some kind of supernatural connection to watch over the home place. I will say that for the next deer season, I couldn't help but look at the cellar door when I was bush hogging, or think about the old man as I entered or exited the woods on the property. Gives me the creeps right now. I'm really bad at telling stories, so this might be awful and I don't really know if this one really counts, but I'll give it a go anyway. Around Halloween of last year, I volunteered at a hayride for the local kids. And we had to stay in a graveyard and it was freezing. So freezing that there was ice sludge. So after we do our job, we decided to head back to a shelter in a park where they serve food for the kids after the hayride. And they let the kids chill. So we got everyone on the bed of the truck to leave. And as we're heading down the road, we realize we're missing a person, and we have no clue where they are. A little after that, we see someone walking down the road, and the driver thought that maybe it was one of our people, so they slowed down to get a better look. And next thing I know, the truck jerked forward, and we sped off. Everyone was majorly confused, but as we were told later that it wasn't one of our people, and the girl we were missing had gotten a ride with her friends. It creeps me out to think about who it could have been. Hey everybody, if you got to the end of the video, please write poop in the comment section below, or whatever you want. Just let me know that you got to the comment section and you watched the video and you enjoyed it in its entirety. Leave a like, leave a comment, because it really helps this channel grow, and I don't know how these videos are going to do. So, short video, I hope you like the different kind of varied content. This is hunting, this is woodsy, and this is winter ghost stories. Well, not ghost stories, I'm so used to doing ghost stories, so a different kind of video anyway. But I mean, I threw in one ghost story, obviously, because, you know, I'm PhantomOfDarkness, can't live without it. Anyway, guys, love you, my cat is annoying me. I'll see you in the next video.